Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thank you so much for being here. Hi, I see you, Roberta. Thank you. All right. I'll go ahead and start so we could dive into the conversation, important topic that we have tonight. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Happy Reyno. I am the Executive Director of BC Bereavement Helpline. And I would like to begin by acknowledging that BC Bereavement Helpline is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Kikay First Nation, and as well as the lands historically shared with other Coast Salish peoples, including those who speak the Alcomilam language. As a provincial organization serving communities across British Columbia, we also acknowledge that our work takes place across the traditional territories of many diverse First Nation, Métis, and Inuit peoples. We would like to invite everyone who's here to join us in the chat and share the traditional territories you're from or you're joining us from. I recognize that we are having today's topic because we wanted to recognize the International Overdose Awareness Month. But also for today, I would like to recognize that today is actually nonprofit National Day. And I would like to honor the founder of BC Bereavement Helpline by having you guys watch this less than 2 minutes video.
These days, the BC Bereavement Helpline supports thousands of people in their grief every year through phone and email support, homicide and suicide grief support groups, support group facilitator training, and grief education. But it wasn't always this way. In British Columbia in the early 80s, bereaved people affected by the death of a close relationship didn't know where to turn. Eventually, Ellen Kearney-Crean from the funeral services industry gathered other caring community members, including doctors, nurses, counselors, and social workers, around a shared vision to help bereaved people find support. The group decided to open up a phone line to provide compassionate listening and grief resources. At first, volunteers answered phones from their own homes. But in 1988, BCBH was established as a charity, moving from home-based operations to office spaces over the following years. In 2011, BCBH created BC Victims of Homicide, a program specific to those who had experienced the death of someone to homicide, and a training program for supporters of sudden death and traumatic loss. And by 2017, BCBH began partnering with the Crisis Center of BC to offer suicide grief support groups. Now, our provincial helpline has assisted over 50,000 calls and emails since its inception in 1988 and continues to be the only free grief-specific phone and email helpline in Canada. The story continues through the work of our caring and compassionate volunteers. Whether you need a resource referral or someone to listen, BC Bereavement Helpline is there. Find out more at bcbh.ca.
Thank you. I thought I'd have you guys watch that video instead of me sharing with you what BC Bereavement Helpline is. Feel free to know more about us at www.bcbh.ca. I'll go ahead and continue. Okay. All right. Sorry. Okay. Just a few announcements. We have been doing our BCBH Grief Walk this summer, and we'll be doing our last this September 4th, honoring the suicide loss. So if you're grieving someone to suicide, please feel free to join us, but this is open to any types of loss. I'll share more details later in the chat for this. And one way that you could be standing behind BC Bereavement Helpline is becoming our community member. So feel free to consider becoming an individual member for the BC Bereavement Helpline. And if you are part of the organization, our membership starts at 30 at individual and 75 at organizational member. So this means that you are supporting and helping us make sure that grief support in British Columbia is free and accessible. And before I introduce our speaker for tonight, allow me to share with you a few housekeeping reminders. Please note that this conversation may be heavy for some of you, so feel free to take a break at any time. Grab something that will keep you grounded, water, tea, tissues, and note that this webinar is actually being recorded. So feel free to turn off your camera as you may like. And we would like to request everyone to create a safe and respectful space by communicating with kindness, compassion, and respect. And notice that some of us here are joining with different types of loss. The chat will be open throughout the session for any of your questions or comments. Feel free to share with them, with us, anything, and we will try to attend to them as time permits in the end. And a short form will be shared in the end. So kindly share a minute of your time for us to continue to improve the webinars. And now I would just like to share that the views and opinions and experiences shared by our webinar speaker are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official views or positions of BC Bereavement Helpline. We wanted to make sure that we are promoting a diverse dialogue and compassionate grief support in terms of learning. So we would like to encourage you guys to reflect on the information and use your own experiences and circumstances in gaining the context of this. All right, allow me to just share with you the speaker that we have for tonight. So it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for tonight, Dr. Alana Abramson. Dr. Abramson has worked in human services since 1999, beginning with Crisis Center of BC and building an extensive career as practitioner, researcher, educator, and trainer in restorative justice. Her work has involved facilitating difficult and deeply human conversations around grief, trauma, suicide, violence, and community healing. She is also an instructor at KPU and trained professionals and communities across BC. In 2017, Dr. Abramson received the Restorative Justice Award from the Ministry of Public Safety and Solicitor General in recognition of her contribution to the restorative justice field. We are very grateful for tonight for her sharing this space with us and her guidance on the conversation and the understanding of substance use and overdose-related grief. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Alana Abramson. I'll stop my sharing and Dr. Alana, feel free to take it over.
Thank you so much for your introduction, Happy, and thank you all for joining. I'm joining from the unceded lands of the Kamloops Shwakatmik people, also known as Kamloops, British Columbia, where gratefully the smoke is clearing a bit. I do want to acknowledge any of you that are coming from or love people who are affected by the devastating fires here in this province and beyond. So they're on our hearts and minds, I know. In addition to what Happy shared about my professional background, this topic is deeply personal. Over the years, I've lost many clients to toxic drug poisoning, and 2 years ago, I lost a friend. So as this topic has been so deep to me, I know that I have to be mindful of the care that Happy expressed for all of us to try to stay grounded as we move through this difficult topic, and just an additional invitation to go off camera if you need to. I know that I've lit a candle to ground me to start here and to remember the people who I've lost and the people who I have gotten to know through running traumatic loss support groups. That's actually what brought me into contact with BCBH. Back in 2019, I knew many homicide survivors through my work in restorative justice that had gotten a lot of benefit from being a part of the traumatic loss support groups that BCBH offers. So I got involved then and got trained as a facilitator, and then went on the board. And now I facilitate support groups in person and virtually, with a particular focus on loss related to toxic drug poisoning or overdose. So I was invited, and I was very honored to be invited to share a little bit about my experiences from those groups and what I've come to learn about this very specific kind of loss. And we're doing this in proximity, of course, to International Overdose Awareness Day that's taking place on August 31st. And so this is a very important day to not only remember the people who we've lost and who we're continuing to lose through toxic drug poisoning, but also to think about prevention as well. And so, we often will hear, I often see or hear on the news these reports, right, about how many people that we've lost. And I think days like Overdose Awareness Day, where there's gatherings and us coming together, we remember not these numbers, right? Behind every number, there is a person, right? And then there is a ripple of people who continue to carry their love and memory. So I just wanted to make mention of that tonight, and to encourage you to find a way to observe, right, this day of acknowledgement on August 31st, and perhaps get to know, if you haven't already, what might be happening in your community. Sorry, I just have to reshare my screen to get something up here. Okay, there we go. All right, so moving on to some of this content, and I will be taking a pause a couple of times through this presentation to invite some personal reflection, and as well as there will be, as Happy said, some time for questions at the end. And so let's dive into the question, which sort of guides this at the start of this, is why can this kind of grief feel so complex? And so what we know is that there's a really important distinction I want to make here, that there isn't necessarily a special category of human grief that belongs only to a death from an overdose. Losing someone we love hurts because we have lost someone who we love, but the circumstances surrounding a death from an overdose adds layers, right? It adds layers to the bereavement experience. And so this slide sort of takes a look at what those overlapping layers are. And the first is the bereavement itself. Someone who mattered is no longer physically present, and the grieving person is trying to understand and adapt to that reality. The second is, and this is similar to the work that I've experienced and maybe some of you have done around suicide and homicide loss, that often this is a traumatic loss. It's not the same as losing somebody to, getting older or to cancer. These deaths are often quite sudden. And so in some cases, family members, loved ones have discovered the person who has died, has witnessed something, or perhaps even previous overdoses, they might have attempted resuscitation and been much more involved in a death compared to other forms of loss. And so all of these things and more create a trauma, right? And trauma impacts us in a multitude of ways. I often think about the holistic impact. There's the physical impact, there's the emotional and psychological impact, there is the relational impact, and then there is the spiritual impact. And out of all of the impacts of trauma, I feel like this is the one that is spoken about most in those grief support groups that I've been honored to be a part of. People saying, am I even to parent anymore now that my son has passed? There's this almost sense of being not tethered to the way that things were, right? Their whole world, our whole world can be turned upside down. And those impacts can be short term, medium term, and are often long term. And then that trauma gets reactivated when we are hit with the news report that so many people died from overdose this month, right? There's these constant reminders and can serve as reactivations for the trauma. So that's a very particular part of these kinds of losses that make them so complicated. The third part of this kind of grief is that there is often a history surrounding substance use. And so families, friends, loved ones might have often lived through years of fear and then hope and maybe conflict, treatment, relapse, boundaries, having boundaries renegotiated, estrangement, reconciliation, and then back to a crisis. And so this push and pull, these cycles can feel really, really exhausting, and add a layer to to that death. I have heard many times people in our group say, on one hand, I miss my loved one terribly. I wish this hadn't have happened. And also, there's a part of me that experiences relief because they're not suffering. And relief, quite frankly, that I'm not suffering anymore. I'm not waiting for that phone call. There's some sort of um, there's a closing of a chapter, and then there's the resounding guilt that comes with for someone feeling that way. I shouldn't be feeling relieved. So these are such complicated emotions, and then there's a lot of self blaming that goes on, and even shame that can serve to disconnect people from their supports. And that leads to this fourth layer of stigma, right? People often respond very differently to an overdose death as they would learning about other deaths. And these are the people in our lives. And so there can be, terribly painful bereavement given these complicating factors. So here's an important distinction that I want to make here, that you know that grief after an overdose is not a different kind of love. The circumstances surrounding the death may be complicated, as we talked about. The relationship itself might have been complicated, but none of that diminishes the significance of the person or the legitimacy of someone's grief, right? And so we sometimes reduce people to the final chapter of their lives, and oftentimes people who have lived through these kinds of losses live with that, right? Live with the very painful and often rude questions that they might hear when their friends or other people in their lives discover that their loved one has died this way. There's a lot of shaming and blaming and stigmatizing language. Even this term overdose is being replaced with toxic drug poisoning, to try to destigmatize. We really try, certainly in our groups, but even in society, I will call people on this if I hear somebody referring to an addict, right? Or a drug death, right? We want to be using people first language, somebody living with addiction, somebody using substances, to have that person first language to really honor their personhood. They are well beyond their actions, and certainly beyond how they died. And so, the goal, of course, for us as we have loved people who might have died in this way, or if we're supporting people who have died in this way, is to support them to remember the whole person. And that's a lot of what our support groups do. In the 8 weeks we come together, as many of you know, we want to fill in who this person who was lost, who are they? What defined them, right? For good and bad, right? Who were they in their wholeness? And being able to look more fully rather than how they passed away. So there's a topic there's a term in the grief literature that some of you might be familiar with, and it's one that our participants often really resonate with, and it is disenfranchised grief. And so this is grief that is not fully recognized, validated, or supported by the social world that we live in. We can think of many deaths that are met immediately with sympathy, right? People bring food, they send cards, they ask about the person who died, they tell stories about them. But When someone dies following substance use, the response can be somewhat different. Questions might contain judgments. I remember a woman in a group I ran recently, when she told her friend that her son had died, their response was immediately, "What were they taking? What were the levels in their blood?" Right? Why were they using? Those kinds of questions are deeply troubling to the bereaved person. Then there's those questions that are incredibly judgmental. Why didn't you do something? Why hadn't they gone to treatment? Any question that starts with why really is layered with judgment. And we would hope that people could do better in these situations. But often, again, because we aren't used to talking often in Western culture for sure about death, these kinds of, you know, these types of deaths are often talked about even less. And so sometimes grieving people will anticipate these reactions. And so, in anticipation of these terrible reactions, they will stop talking, they will shut down, they will withdraw, which can be really add to those layers of pain and isolation that they might already be experiencing. And so, what happens in a lot of our groups is we hear that the support group that they attend, that is the only place where they're 100% honest about how their loved one died. I've heard that so many times that they have told even other family members they've made up something else. They conceal the circumstances of the death, and they say it was a heart attack, it was a stroke. And so that kind of tension, that kind of sort of moral injury, right? Of feeling forced to say something that isn't true, and that might go very much against their values, but it protects them against those judgmental questions. And so a lot of folks are grappling with that, right? Living with this, dishonesty, because that is the only way that they can protect themselves, and it makes sense. So, this is a really important piece, right? That's disenfranchised grief concept is very important and really relevant to this topic that we're talking about today. So, this is our first opportunity to just stop and reflect for about 20 to 30 seconds. I want you to just, think to yourself privately. You don't have to write anything in the chat or share anything at this moment, but just think to yourself, what changes when a person's grief is met with judgment rather than compassion? What changes? And you might think, what changes for the individual? What changes for those relationships? What changes for the person in relationship to the traumatic loss? You know, what changes when we might experience judgment rather than compassion? So I'm just going to stop talking here for just 20 seconds as we sit and consider this.
Recording in progress.
Thanks, everyone. I think sometimes when we gather this way, and I know we're only together for a short time, it can feel like a lot of talking or listening. And so it's nice to just pause and sort of ruminate or integrate or reflect on some of these big questions. So when I was thinking about this question, I think about that it feels like just another burden, another task for the bereaved person to deal with, right? It's just one more thing that they are burdened with, how to talk about this, if to talk about, who is going to be safe to talk to. So instead of them simply being permitted to mourn, right? The bereaved might now also feel like they have to explain or defend or hide or even justify their grief. And so it's that additional like heaviness that I certainly see in many of the people that I work with through our support groups. See, the other thing, and I've spoken a little bit about this already, is just how grief can hold so many contradictions, right? And I think for yourself, if you're coming here because you've lost a loved one, or if you're trying to think about how to better support those who have lost a loved one in this way, is just to normalize that these contradictions normalize these contradictions that they are normal, that they exist. Because I think, again, we can feel like we're losing our minds when one moment we're feeling relief and the next minute we're feeling anger, and then we're feeling shame for feeling relief, right? It can be really topsy-turvy. And so I think it's just helpful to normalize that, we can deeply love the person who has died and also be pissed at them, be angry with them, right? We can hold those things. It's a both and. Someone can be devastated by the death, and often experience that relief, that the long period of fear and crisis and pain and the unknown is over. A parent, partner, or a sibling may have spent many, many years wondering every time the phone rang whether this was going to be the call, right? When that terrible call finally comes, that fear can end, but for the worst reason, right? Because so many of us hold out that hope still. Feeling some relief from that vigilance doesn't mean that the person wanted their loved one to die, of course, right? And that's where the shame sort of eats away, and it can be really hard to get out of that shame spiral. There also, as in with other traumatic losses, there can be guilt and resentment, anger, and also a longing, a sadness, a numbness. There can even, and this is the thing that surprised me the most when I started facilitating the grief groups, is there are moments of laughter. Even as we're crying, there are moments of laughter as we fully bring the person that we loved into the room and remember what brought us joy about them and times that we shared. And again, that can be really confusing. People in those groups apologize. I'm so sorry for laughing. I don't even know why I'm laughing, right? And so again, those contradictions can feel really difficult at times and are completely normal. So conflicting feelings are not evidence of conflicting love, right? And so giving people permission to hold one of those, more than one of those truths can be really important. The other piece that people who have lost someone to overdose carry, is the weight of the what if, right? Oftentimes, we search backwards for a moment that could have changed the ending, right? What if I had called? What if I had called more often? What if I had shown up? What if I had noticed XYZ? What if I had set a different boundary? What if I tried one more time? What if I said something different? So many times I think back at the conversations I had with my friend and think, what if I had just said this one thing? Right. And even though as a grief educator and as somebody with this experience, I know that it's so unhelpful. I tend to do that. Our brains tend to go into those pathways because we desperately want to have a changed outcome, right? But the thing I like to remind myself is that we're evaluating our past decisions using information we got later on, right? The person we were at that moment where we're like, oh, what could I have done differently? Didn't even know what the person we are today knows, right? And so again, that doesn't automatically remove regret or guilt, but it certainly can help us approach ourselves and others, I think, with a lot of compassion. So let's look, at when you are grieving, right? When you are grieving, if you're here because you are the person that's grieving a loss, rather than giving you a checklist for, doing grief correctly, because there's no correct way. There's not one way. I'd like to offer you four permissions and see how these land for you. I know sometimes when I've done this with others, there's that automatic like defensiveness, like, no, that's not true for me. So if that's coming up, please know that that's completely normal. But I'd like to offer you these. First is that, again, maybe in line with what I just said, that you have permission to feel, and you have the permission to numb out at times, right? There's no correct emotional response and no timetable to produce one, right? And so we used to talk about the stages of grief as if it were linear, right? That we're at this stage, and then we're angry, and then we're this, and then we're acceptance, right? It doesn't work that way. It's messy. And different feelings can come on like waves. And I know for myself, sometimes, even today, after all these years, where thinking about a client, a particular client, can feel like it's about to knock me off my feet. And that comes, it seems to come out of nowhere. And so these can be deeply unpredictable, or very unpredictable, which makes them more unsettling. So give yourself the permission to feel, know that there is not a right way, and that there isn't a timetable. And this is one of the benefits, I think, from our support groups, is that somebody that their loss is more recent can be in the same circle as somebody whose loss is years down the road. And so that they can notice, oh, hey, that person is there, I'm here, and they're still getting benefit from coming and sharing and talking about it. And I think, it doesn't mean like, oh, you're 5 years into your loss and that you still need a support group. It's nothing like that. The grief shifts, right? It changes over time. I know that one of the parents that was in one of my last groups had come, their loss of their child was many years ago, but their second child was approaching the age when their first child had died. And so there was a lot coming up for them, and they thought, now it's time. This is a different stage in my loss, and now I need to come back to a group and get some additional support. So there's many reasons, right, where our grief ebbs and flows through time. The second is permission to remember, or the permission, sorry, not to explain, that you get to decide who knows the circumstances of the death and how much you want to say. And so again, there is no judgment. Certainly in our circles, it happens so frequently that people do not share the details of the death with people that are even close to them, that it starts to get, that people have less judgment about themselves because they hear, oh my gosh, you didn't say how your loved one died in detail either. Okay, right? And then often through the process of discussing that, sometimes different choices are made, and sometimes they're not. But whatever you decide, you get to decide, right? And you have the permission to how much you want to say, whether or not you want to say anything at all, and who you're talking with. The third is the permission to remember the whole person, right? Remember the person before the substance use, during, and during it, their strengths, their difficulties, the good memories, and the complicated ones. And, for those of you who have attended a support group, you know that we have a very powerful part of the group called restorative storytelling, where we talk about our loved ones and share all of the idiosyncrasies, the highs and lows, the way they grew up, or memories. Remembering them in their wholeness is really important. And finally, the permission to seek connection, right? Not everybody in your life, as you might have learned, is capable of providing the kind of support that you need. So finding just one person or one space where you don't have to edit the story, that can really matter. And that's why BC Bereavement Helpline exists, right? These call takers are very experienced in holding space for grief. So if you are someone who has lost a loved one and nobody is coming to mind that feels like a safe enough person to share in that unedited way, you know that you can always call the helpline. So here are some practical ways to support your own grief. I suppose that was one, to call the helpline, to reach out, to have your one person, your go-to person that you can be unedited with. But also to remember grief is emotional, but it's also physical and practical. And so in times of intense grief and trauma, the very basic things can become the most difficult. Eating, we either eat too much or things we might that don't make us feel so good, or if you're me, I forget to eat when I'm grieving. And it will take somebody to say to me, "Have you eaten today?" And I'll be like, "Not today and not yesterday," as I think about it. And so someone to remind you, or even a little sticky note, right? Or an alarm on your phone, to remind you to eat. Difficulty sleeping is completely normal, either wanting to sleep all day or having really interrupted sleep, even flashbacks, bad dreams. It's often difficult to concentrate, to remember things. I always celebrate every single grief group where people arrive because it's hard to remember even basic appointments when you're grieving. Very difficult to make decisions. And so giving yourself again that grace that these things do happen. And so what are some things, either people or practical things that you can put in your life, very simple things, whether it's a reminder on your phone or a note to help you with those basic pieces. Um, yeah, so I guess also it says on the slide, lower expectations during periods of acute grief. You might, don't set yourself up in the sense that you really want to, I don't know, go for a walk. But that day that you're going to go for that walk, you wake up and you can't get out of bed, it's okay, if you need to sit with that, that's okay, right? If you can protect some basic routines, that's helpful. But keep your expectations fairly low, right? You're not, our bodies are going through so much, and it's often not possible to function at our usual capacity. And then again, if you're someone like myself, that's kind of a high achiever, I start to beat myself up about that. Well, I should be able to. And as a wise therapist used to remind me, Alana, stop shoulding yourself, right? Anytime I'd say, I should be doing this, I should be seeing you more, I should be working out, she would stop me and say, stop shoulding yourself. And I think that's stuck with me. So recognizing our lowered capacity, it's not a failure, it's our way of our bodies taking care of ourselves. I remember another great piece of wisdom. A more recent therapist said to me, I went through a particularly difficult time around some traumatic it wasn't a loss through an overdose, but it was a different kind of traumatic experience. And I said, I can't get out of bed. I'm so distressed. I haven't been able to get out of bed for 3 days. And she said, well, isn't that remarkable? I said, yes, it's remarkable. That's why I'm here. She said, it's remarkable. Look at how well your body's taking care of itself and giving you what you need by resting. It blew my mind. It was a total transformation in the way that I looked at the desire or the need for my body to take rest. So it wasn't a failure. It wasn't I was not working hard enough, so I allowed that, right? I wanted to welcome that way that my body was giving me that message that I needed to rest. So um yeah, so thinking about those kinds of things, and sort of embracing ourselves without judgment, just like we would want someone in our life to not judge, how we were coping or maybe having a hard time coping. Some people find comfort in maintaining a connection with the person who died. In our groups, we welcome photographs or sharing of songs, maybe cooking that person's favorite food, visiting a meaningful place, writing to them. I remember a wonderful woman in our last group used to talk to her son who had died every day, every morning. She'd sit and have coffee and talk with him and get some guidance sometimes, and then she would start her day. It was a ritual that she'd built in to connect with the memory of her son, and she would say it was more than a memory. She was like, he gives me good advice, and then she would write about it and she would share with us, marking their birthday, telling stories about them. These are all examples of what we call continuing bonds. The other piece to take care of ourselves and to support our own grief is to think about and prepare for triggers or activations and significant dates. So birthdays could be a significant date that can be particularly hard, or the day that the person passed away could be also be that activator, or major holidays as well, especially if those were holidays that you would celebrate together. And so thinking about that, trying to have a little bit of prediction and inviting just a question of how will you take care of yourself when things become really heavy that day and don't feel, and it's hard too. I know anytime our support groups meet and there's a major holiday, and it could be Thanksgiving or even things like Halloween can be really activating for people who used to celebrate Halloween with their loved one, right? That it's a really difficult time, especially because you've got your memories, you've got your grief, and you have a whole bunch of people in your outside world that are celebrating, right? And able to be with their families. So there's almost can be a feeling like of resentment building up as well towards people who aren't living with our experience of grief, which again can make us feel like bad people because, well, we can't be happy for them. So it's all of these layers can get very, very heavy. So I've mentioned peer or professional grief support. This has been really meaningful in my life, and I continue to access therapy. Having said that, it is not accessible to all of us, right? And so again, the BH helpline is free, and sometimes there are free or pro bono resources that we might be able to access to help us through the harder times. And for me, it's about giving me like strategies to help through these difficult times so that I could become a little bit more resilient through those hard times. All right, so we're going to switch gears now to supporting someone else who's grieving. So the first piece we looked at was, what do we do if we're grieving? Now, how do we support others who are grieving? And so language is important, as I think I've mentioned. I have heard some terribly insensitive things and very hurtful things people have said over time as they're trying to listen to somebody who has a traumatic loss. I've definitely had people say to me, at least they're not suffering, right? Okay. Um, Definitely have heard everything happens for a reason, also particularly unhelpful. So instead of saying those things, and I want to normalize right now, if you have found yourself saying any of these things on the left, that this is not motivated by bad intentions, right? We say these things because we want to help, right? We see somebody in front of us that's in pain and we don't want them to feel that way. So we say some things that maybe aren't so helpful. So I just want to recognize that right now. I know I've said some, I'm sure, very unhelpful things over the course of my life with good intentions, and they haven't landed in the way that I have intended. So how can we use language differently? Well, maybe instead of at least they're not suffering, you could say something like, I'm so sorry. I know how much you loved them. I get a lot of disclosures around loss as a teacher. A lot of my students are losing people in traumatic and not so traumatic ways sometimes. And one of the first things I ask is, would you like to tell me about them, right? Tell me a bit. What was their name, right? If I don't know their name. Um, Instead of everything happens for a reason, just normalize that silence is can be helpful. And you can. I had a mentor that used to say, sometimes there are no words, and the most respectful thing you can do when you're holding space with someone is just to hold that space and to sit in silence. And so saying, I don't have the words that can make this okay, but I'm here. Instead of saying you need to stay strong, just normalizing you don't have to be okay with me. And also saying I know exactly how you feel is can be feel quite disingenuous. I know when people have said that to me, even if their loss is similar, there's this voice in my heart that goes, no, you don't. You couldn't possibly know. So what's more helpful is I can't know exactly what this is like for you, but I can listen or I can witness. And I can't understate the importance of witnessing. Sometimes it doesn't feel like enough. It feels like nothing, but also it can feel like everything to the person who's being witnessed. So really what we want to be communicating in our body language, in our voice tone, in our words is that I see your pain, I'm not frightened by it, and you don't need to make it smaller for me, right? We talked earlier about how oftentimes folks who have lost someone to overdose are already living with a lot of guilt, and then that additional burden and how to tell people, do I tell people? We don't want to give them the additional burden of consoling the listener, right? And so while I think tears are okay. Um, you know, having empathy is okay. We don't want to put the bereaved person in the situation where they're making things smaller or trying to protect us. So anything we can do to communicate that is really powerful. And noting that support is more than words, right? Support is it can be about language, but it's also about presence, right? As I mentioned, it's about witnessing. We can acknowledge what has happened without trying to explain it. We can be curious about their experiencing, about what the person's experiencing, rather than assuming what they need. Um, and instead of saying, let me know if you need anything, I think I've said that to people so many times. Um, Again, that's putting the burden on the grieving person to try to identify and articulate and then ask for a need. And so instead, try to make specific offers, right? I'm going grocery shopping tomorrow. Can I pick up anything for you? Right? I'm making dinner Thursday. Can I leave some at your door? Would you like some company to that appointment? Right? And keep showing up, right? Um, there's often way more support immediately after the death, but then 6 months later, on the person's birthday, approaching the anniversary of the death, that support has disappeared. So even a message, a text message, or a phone call, or an email, I was thinking about you and the person who had died today. That can make a huge impact on somebody, because these are losses that they will be carrying. And as I mentioned earlier, like that grief comes in those waves, and we can't know when that next wave will come for the person we're trying to support, but just that reminder that we're there when it comes can be really, really meaningful. And of course, support is going to look different depending on your role, right? Not everyone has the same role and responsibility or responsibility. And so one of the things that we do in our support groups is we invite people to draw concentric circles, right? And the circles then put names of people over there. They put themselves in the middle, then they draw a circle around themselves, and then we ask, okay, who are the people or pets in your life that are your go-to, right? That they are your immediate support. If you needed something in an emergency, this person you could call. Then this next circle out are people who, you might not call in an emergency, but you know that they're there for you, right? And then there's another circle that consists of professionals, people that may not be, family or friends, but what are other, the helpline could be out there, a therapist might be out there, a doctor, a pastor, an elder, right? These are people in that external circle. There, you might not call them, at 2 o'clock in the morning, but you know that they're there. And so these sorts of concentric circles, are really important to remind people of when they are feeling really alone in their grief. So, a close friend might be able to sit there for an hour and listen to the story and to check in and to remember those significant dates and to offer to pick up the groceries that day or whatever. And that's important for sure. In fact, what we know about recovery or resilience to traumatic loss is that the stronger the relationships between professionals and non-professionals like friends and family are, the more resilient people are, right? It's not people often will say, "Oh, you're so strong," as if it was an individual sort of disposition. It's not. Resilience comes from our relationships. And it's tough, right? Because sometimes in that place of grief, the last thing we want to do is reach out and connect with somebody. But those relationships are there, remembering those threads of connection between friends and family and others in those circles it can be really helpful. And then to pull on those threads when you need to. And if the person isn't, that we as supporters can pull those threads to remind that we're there. So if you're a colleague or a supervisor, there's opportunity to help the grieving person. That is different than a friend or a family, right? Creating flexibility about returning to work or schedules, respecting people's privacy, and or avoid assuming that someone should be back to normal after their specified bereavement leave, after a specific number of days, right? And so everybody experiences loss differently, and recognizing that grief comes and goes in those waves. And just because somebody was okay on a Monday, that doesn't mean that they might be okay on a Friday. And just to notice when we might be assuming that that grief is in that linear projection. Um, a service provider, how we can help is to, I think, use those sort of non-stigmatizing language, using compassion, having professional boundaries. And then there's also space, and I see the power of community in my community where I live, on Overdose Awareness Day and Purple Ribbon campaigns, and so many things that we do in community, including offering those traumatic loss support groups. I see how community can be a place where our loved ones can be remembered and people can be supported. And that's what the grief groups do, is create a sense of community, where it wasn't there before, and people can hold each other through those hard times. So, if you're supporting somebody with this kind of grief, a really helpful question, no matter where you are, whether you're a friend or a family or a supervisor or a community member, you could ask, what would feel supportive right now? And it's okay if they don't know, right? And normalize, it's okay if you don't know. We can check back tomorrow, right? This communicates care without assuming that we know what another person needs. So that is sort of the end of the content. I hope that was helpful in weaving some of my own experiences through, and also offering you what is present in the literature around this very specific kind of grief and loss. We've looked at both the experiences of people who have had this kind of loss, and also people who want to support those who have. So I'd like to open up the remaining time for any questions, and it doesn't have to be a question. Maybe you came tonight and you thought, yep, nothing new here. These are all things that I'm already doing or already know. That's wonderful. I hope that feels really affirming to you. So, you might have even more experience than I do, in this area. So it doesn't have to be a reflection. It can, excuse me, a question. It can be a reflection. And I just want to highlight again, you don't need to share personal experiences in order to ask a question. General questions are totally welcome. I hope I have the answer, some sort of reflection. And, if something really personal does come up, I probably will respond more generally, because this is an educational webinar, versus sort of individual counseling or consulting, and I certainly am not a counselor, so I don't want to put myself out there as such. So I'm going to stop talking and invite some reflections now, or questions. You can just unmute yourself, or you can type in the chat. Well, thanks, Nancy. Resilience comes from relationships as an aha moment. Yes. Yes, and it's such a double-edged sword, because I know when I am in grief, I want to push people away, right? And so it can be counterintuitive to pull people closer. And so just even the reminder that those threads exist, that there are people there for me, can help me through those hard moments. And what we know about trauma recovery is even mentally thinking about a person that supports you, or a place that gives you comfort, Or imagining, if you're a cat person like me, imagining that cat on your lap that you're stroking, even if the cat's not there, that can help reduce that activation, which is amazing, right? Our minds are incredible things. So we can support our grounding in how we use our thoughts. And I like to remember that when it comes to support. I might not be ready to pick up that phone, but I can just think about that person who loves me in that moment. Go ahead, June.
Thanks, Elena. As I was listening to you talk about the instead of saying this, consider that instead, I can't help but wonder or think how, as a society, we were taught to say the wrong things all along and how wrong we could be, you know. And often because we know when we say what we're taught, it's going to come across offensive. So people sometimes choose silence instead of reaching out. I it just baffles me how we were taught to, to say the wrong things. All the instead of. We were taught to say these things. And now we have to be re-educated.
That's such a great point. Yeah, and that great additional point to what I was saying about nobody says these things with the intention to cause harm, right? That's just not how we work. We see somebody suffering, and we might feel so uncomfortable. We just want to make it better. And yes, you're right. Like we have been taught, we have been given these messages about what people might want to hear, or we've heard them ourselves, right? Like you're going to get over this. Tomorrow's a new day. That's the one I always heard, right? And it's like, well, I can't even see to the next hour. How am I thinking about tomorrow? But these are messages we've received, whether or not they're helpful, and then we pass them along. So I love that. It's like an unlearning of those messages. Yeah, Sherry.
Thank you so much for hosting this. Um, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Thank, thank you so much for hosting this. It's actually really, and it's a lot of terminology, it's a lot of slang. Like when you look at medical assistant dying and people still call it suicide and learning the new language and being being able to support other people. I I find I write a lot of poetry and I try to support a lot of people. Like I included my poem about suicide and I included, my poem with support or little things like that. It's almost easier for me to do complex things than more simple ones, but um I think I seem to gravitate into that where I want to be of support for people going through grief and loss. Um, I've had a lot of grief and loss in my own life, and I think the top of Maslow's pyramid isn't self-actualization, it's filling in the bottom. And to be able to be present with some of the most amazing psychologists and like teachers and just people that are putting their time and energy out and the different modalities, I'm really grateful to be a part of it. So thank you very much for hosting this tonight.
Thank you. And I'm going to spend some time with your poem. Thank you for the generosity of sharing it. I think writing poetry, reading poetry, journaling, art, being in nature, getting our hands dirty in our garden, as you say, Sherry or Cherie, there's so many different modalities, and it's finding what works best for us. And I do think that there is a lot of hopefulness as we're starting to see even more, like such a wide range of healing modalities out there. Long are gone are the days of, here's your antidepressant. Thank goodness, right? Thank goodness. Go ahead, Marlene.
Just want to say what was most beneficial for me was that you acknowledged the fact that grief doesn't end after a finite time. It's been 8 years for me, and it seems like it's been. I had a couple of years where it seemed easier and just I don't know why, but the last couple of years it seems to have come back really badly. So that's kind of nice to hear that that's not, you know, unusual, or that there's other people who would share that too. And the other ritual you talked about, the woman talking to her son, and even after 8 years, I don't talk to him in the morning, but I have his big funeral picture on the mantle, and I say goodnight to him every night before I go to bed. And if I forget, I get up out of bed and I have to do it, and I have to um, blow a kiss and say I love you and miss you every day for 8 years. And I don't think I'll ever stop doing that as long as I'm able to do it. So thank you for acknowledging those two things for me.
Thank you for sharing about that beautiful ritual that you have with your son. And I can hear in your voice just so how laden with love that when you speak of him. And yeah, and the thing is, I feel like some people who like yourself, if it comes back, and I've heard that many times, I don't know why now. Then there's the second thought is I've regressed somehow. And that's actually not like, that's exactly why we talk about grief as messy, because it's not like you get here and then you're moving backward. It's a different stage, right? And sometimes people know what triggered that, like the person I mentioned about their child getting to the same age as the other child that had died. And sometimes we don't know. And we might never know, and that makes it a little unsettling too. But I'm glad that you took that away, Marlene, that it is completely normal. All right, I'll pass it back to you, Happy.
Thanks so much, Dr. Alana. Thank you for presenting this beautifully. I think we can see from the many hearts earlier how much people appreciated it. And I would like to thank you guys for staying behind. I appreciate you sharing all your experiences. Marlene, our heart goes to you, and thank you so much for sharing that. As you can see, this conversation is a little bit heavy for some of you. So please, grab something that will keep you grounded after this webinar. We are going to be open from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Mondays through Fridays. So feel free to call our helpline at any time. I've shared the ways that you could access some of our grief resources related to substance use in our website, and that will outline how you can join our wait list for the support group as well. So hopefully, everything is helping. If you are grieving or supporting someone who is grieving, if you're a caregiver, thanks so much for continuously educating yourself. I really appreciate each and one of you. Dr. Alana, thank you so much for all of the insights and guidance that you have shared with us tonight. All right, we'll close the webinar. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good night. You take care. I hope to see you in one of our events.
Thank you so much, everyone,
Bye,
for being
everyone.
here and your questions and your comments. Um, have a gentle night. Thank you again.
Thank you,
Thank
Happy.
you.
Thank you,
It,
Elena.
it was a wonderful